You guys with real jobs, I don't know how you do it. Let me say too, before we start, I mean, your daily emails, I don't know how you do it. The flow of ideas and
Oh,
keeping
thank you.
fresh and new every day. That's incredible. Really
Not,
impressive.
I appreciate that. I stole the idea from Seth Godin. You know Seth? You familiar with Seth Godin?
Well, I know who he is, and I've
Yeah.
seen him with you several
Yeah.
times. Yeah.
So he said back in the day, I used to do a weekly blog and I took so much time to do that. And I maybe had like 200 posts up over a couple years. And he told a course once I was in, it's easier to do a daily blog than a weekly blog. And I thought he was like on heroin when he told me that. I thought he was smoking crack. Like there's no
Yeah.
shot.
Yeah.
When you do it daily, you just allot a little bit of time to it, and you're always looking for an idea. When it's once a week, it's kind of like I'm good doing something every day. I'm kind of not great doing something every now and then, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I get it. Because
No, I
I
appreciate it. Thanks for noticing, though. I appreciate
because
it.
I informally changed my newsletter from once a month to once a week at the beginning of the year. And I agree with you. I never would have expected this. It's easier to do it more frequently than less frequently. But
It is. What do you think that is? Like creatively, it's like you're always looking for that idea more frequently, and you're in the
yeah,
rhythm more and the pattern, right?
yeah, once a month I was pretty much starting from scratch every month. Once in a while
Mhm.
I'd have an idea for a couple months out, but usually it'd be like the third week of the month. Just, oh God, what am I going to do this month?
Yeah.
Now it's a constant flow.
Yeah. I love looking at the books in the background, man. I see some great reads back there. Oh my gosh, there's some great books behind you.
They occupied a lot of time. Yeah, a lot
Oh
of
my,
Churchill stuff and other
yeah.
stuff.
What we'll get into the book. And when is the launch day of the book?
It's March 17th, St. Patrick's Day.
I'll put this as close as I can to the 17th. I'll put this right by it.
Okay, I mean, I know you have so much going on.
Absolutely. No,
I
I'll
appreciate
jump
it.
you. I love jumping authors ahead when their books come out because it's
I
so
know you
baller.
jumped me in line for this too, so thank you for
No,
that.
absolutely. You got it, man. 'Cause I remember our last time when Billy connected us. He's like, "Yeah, talk to my uncle," and I'm like, "Sure, man. I didn't know you at all." Like he's just like,
I
"Billy
know.
said you got to talk to my uncle." I'm like, "Done deal." I was a great first one, and you're kind of following that Ryan Holiday. That like Ryan always goes, "What's the best way to promote your book?" Write the next one, right?
Oh yeah, I've stolen so much from him. His book, Perennial, it's
Oh,
probably his worst selling book, Perennial Seller.
how good
I
is it
don't know
though?
that for a fact, but I've read it twice and listened to it twice and read it once.
It's so funny you say that. I base my podcast on some of the principles in that book, specifically like that evergreen material where
Oh yeah,
I try to record a podcast that if we listen to what we discussed 3 years from now, it's just as relevant because we're not talking about the current election or what's going on in the world. We're talking like principles or history, like stuff that's timeless,
thank
right? That
goodness.
you could
Yeah.
discuss it like a
Mhm.
year ago or 5 years later. It's the same conversation because what we're talking
Oh
about is
yeah.
not going to change. Make sure I hit record here.
Okay.
We're good to go. Cool. All right, here we go. Let's rock and roll. Bill Whiteside, welcome
Joseph,
back to Built Not Born.
so nice to be back. So nice to meet you just once, but for you to have me back a second time, I thoroughly appreciate that. Thank you
You
for the
got
support.
it. So, Bill, for our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work, who are you and what do you do?
I'm now an author. I live in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I have a very unlikely background for an author, specifically an author of a work about Winston Churchill and an interesting battle in World War II. My background is in sales and marketing. Along the way, I developed this infatuation with Winston Churchill. It was fueled initially by my mom. She gave me a biography on Churchill, and I was just captivated by what a character he was in every sense of the word, his sense of humor, his just his steadfast character, and the impact he had on Great Britain in the war. One of the biographies I read, it talked about an instance early in the war in Churchill's second month as prime minister, where the Royal Navy attacked a squadron of French ships and destroyed the ships and killed almost 1,300 French seamen. And I'm not sure if I did a literal double take, but my initial impression was that can't be right. I must have read that wrong. And then I realized I read it right. And then I'm thinking, well, he must have gotten that story wrong because it was so unlikely because the two nations had been allies 2 weeks before that. French sailors had sailed on British ships, British sailors were quartered on French ships. But then shortly before this incident, France signed its armistice with Germany. And Churchill's biggest fear, especially with the United Kingdom being an island, was that Hitler was going to take possession of the newest and biggest ships in the French Navy, integrate them with the Kriegsmarine, and either attack Britain or strangle Britain from the sea, or both. So his main goal was to ensure that the ships did not fall into German hands. He didn't set out to destroy the French ships. He gave them several options for them to comply with British demands and to either align themselves with the Royal Navy or scuttle their own ships. And when one admiral in particular refused to negotiate, at the end of the day, it was just a 10-minute battle, highly unlikely clash. And as I've worked on this for a long time, and I found that a lot of people either don't know about it or they don't know all the details about it.
I thought I knew my World War II history. The only time I've ever heard of this battle, and tell me if I'm wrong,
Mm-hmm.
Eric Larson's book, The Splendid and the Vile. He
Yes,
mentions it like maybe a paragraph or a page. Like it's barely mentioned, but it's in that book, right?
it is. He's probably done the most to bring it to public awareness. And one thing about that, he started his book tour for The Splendid and the Vile during COVID. So it was a virtual book tour. And I happened to watch a session like this. Someone was interviewing Eric Larson online about the book. And one of her questions was, what was your biggest surprise during the course of your research? And he said it was the British attack on the French ships early in the war. And I was heavily into my research at that point, almost fell out of my chair. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I hope Eric Larson doesn't write this book.
That's game over there. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
oh wow, that because
Unfortunately, he wrote this
you
together.
found your little niche, right? Like you went
Yeah,
so deep, like went 2 miles deep. You found this battle that no one's heard of, and all of a sudden you hear Larson talk about it. Like, almost like James
yeah, it was
Patterson's talking about it.
great
Yeah,
validation
yeah.
that I'm on a
So,
good path.
so here, let's talk about the story and why it matters. Okay, so your book, Operation Catapult. Let's
Mhm.
just call it Churchill's darkest decision, right? How about this? July 3rd, 1940. Let's set the stage. The British Royal Navy, you think, opens fire on French warships in Algeria. They're not enemies. You think they were allies weeks before. Weeks before, they're on the same ships, right?
Yes.
Almost like you said, 1,300 French sailors die in like 13 minutes. I mean, the tragedy. Most people never heard of Operation Catapult. Why do you think this story matters today? And what made you say, I need to write this book?
To answer your second question first, as I got deeper into it, I mean, the story itself was so surprising. And then you get past Winston Churchill and you read about some of the other characters involved, specifically the naval officers involved. My first official, I was still working a full time job as a software salesman, but my first real research visit, I went over to London and then we took a train to Cambridge and I spent 3 days there in the Churchill archives looking through a little bit of Churchill's papers, but spent more time with actually several Royal Navy officers and one British general. And as you learn more about the story, you learn that almost everybody under Churchill was against this. They were horrified at the thought of firing on their friends. So it also became a human interest story. And not that Churchill had to overcome, he issued the final orders, but he also had a passion for France. And he was also horrified at the thought of firing on people he knew and on the nation that he considered almost sacred. But his bottom line was what is in the best interest of England. And again, he wanted to make sure that England's chance to win the war, especially at a time well before the US joined the war,
Yeah,
was not compromised by the loss of the French ships to Germany.
yeah.
So he was hell bent to make sure that he did not lose control of those ships. So that was his guiding principle in all this. It's a story about someone with an absolute firm moral compass. He knew what his bottom line was, he stuck with it. It made some personally difficult and even tragic decisions to enforce that.
Some people call this Churchill's darkest decision.
Okay, yep.
Churchill, one of the epic figures in history. He's prime minister. He's got Hitler breathing down his neck. France has collapsed. Now he's got to decide, does he blow up the French ships before the Nazis can take them? What do you think's going through his head? And like, Why do you think, why do you think that was his move? Like, what do you think led him to that instead of something else? That was a big call.
Yeah, again, number one, it was in the best interest of the nation that Churchill led to ensure that the German Navy was not strengthened by taking over the French ships.
Mhm.
When Germany overran Czechoslovakia,
Yeah.
they took over the Skoda Ironworks and they started producing Panzer tanks in Czechoslovakia. And everything pointed to the likelihood of Admiral Raeder and Admiral Donitz incorporating the French ships into their fleet. So Churchill was not about to allow that to happen. There is also a sense of personal betrayal because before Churchill was prime minister, he was still first lord of the Admiralty. In the middle of March 1940, there was a meeting of the Supreme War Council where Britain and France agreed that neither country would seek a separate armistice or peace treaty with Germany without the other's consent. And at that point, the serious fighting had not really started. And it was very matter of fact. And of course, neither of us will do that without the other's consent. And then beginning on May 11th, 1940, in France's case, France was quickly overrun by German forces. Most of the British army sailed back across the English Channel from Dunkirk. So France was left largely fighting the war on the ground by themselves. And they reached the point where they said, hey, we can't fight anymore. We've got nothing left and very little left to fight for. We want to find out what the armistice terms are from Germany. And Churchill referred to that agreement. And at first he said no. He said, we intend to fight. He said, you still have your Navy. Your Army's been decimated. Your Air Force was wiped out, but your Navy is undefeated. So let's keep them fighting. And Paul Reynaud, the Premier of France, finally said, no, we have to request their terms. And Churchill said, okay, based on that agreement, Britain will give you the okay to request Germany's armistice terms as long as you sail your ships to Britain or to the United States. And in the end, France just disregarded that. They sought armistice terms, they signed the armistice and capitulated to Germany by mid-June of 1940.
You write that Admiral Somerville, the
Yes.
guy commanding the British fleet, he's the one who has to pull the trigger on this particular operation. And he calls it the biggest political blunder of modern times. He didn't want to do it. So, what's that tell us about the decision to fire on your allies? What do you think his holdback was?
He found it personally hateful. He mentioned the battle was in a harbor called Mers el Kabir. And about 4 miles away, there was another harbor called Oran, which was a larger city. And one of the challenges in writing this book is people would use Oran and Mers el Kabir interchangeably, even when they're talking about Mers el Kabir. So at one point, Somerville said, I don't want to be remembered as the cold-hearted butcher of Oran. So he didn't want to be the person to inflict this on his friends. He also believed that his relationship and the relationship of Captain Cedric Holland, who was Somerville's appointed negotiator, was strong enough with the French that they could convince them to bow to the other British demands before it became necessary to fire upon them. That they could convince them either to sail their ships to a neutral port or to scuttle them themselves. So he had high confidence in that.
Churchill has to stand in front of Parliament in London and explain why he just ordered British guns to kill French sailors. And what happens? A standing ovation. The Parliament gives Churchill a standing ovation. What's that saying? But when you bring all Parliament to your feet, and that's very contentious in Parliament, such a big call like that, killing allies. How do you think?
Yeah,
Why do you
that
think that
was
was so well received?
partly because Churchill was so convincing. And it was the battle was on July 3rd. The speech to Parliament was on July 4th, almost literally 24 hours after the firing began and ended. And there were still some things that were unknown. They weren't sure of which ships had been sunk, whether or not a key ship had escaped. So it was Churchill's goal to inform Parliament of the details, which he was one of the few people who were privy to that. The other interesting aspect of that day was Churchill had only been prime minister for 55 days. and he was not yet widely accepted in the government. He was pretty well embraced by his conservative party, but there was still some bitterness from people who wished that Neville Chamberlain was still their prime minister. And then the other parties were even less inclined to embrace Churchill. And he gave an overview of why he felt the attack was necessary. Then he gave a very dramatic account of the attack. And I found this little nugget of information in the New York Times reporting on that speech, where it said towards the end, he held his arms out wide and just walked in a circle around the room and faced all four sides of the people. And so I let the judgment up to the British people, to the Americans, and to the world. And he took his seat. And as you said, there was a standing ovation. And from everybody there, from every party, and it was the first time that he was universally accepted by the ministers who governed Britain. And I got emotional about this. The first dozen or so times I read this or wrote about that, Churchill started crying uncontrollably because it just registered with him that, you know, I'm finally accepted by these people who matter to me. And he sat there on the Treasury bench with his chin down into his chest and tears just cascading down his cheeks. And what he did with that, it was not a great naval victory, but his action and his speech helped convince Britain that they had selected the right man to be their wartime prime minister. And again, he was not universally accepted when the king asked him to become prime minister. He didn't have to do a lot of convincing of Franklin Roosevelt. You know, this was, I think, 17 months before Pearl Harbor. So the US was not yet in the war. And Roosevelt, you know, we were neutral, and Roosevelt was inclined to help him any way he could, but there was not a lot he could do. But it absolutely convinced Roosevelt that Churchill and Britain had the character to hold out as long as they possibly could against Germany. It also convinced Adolf Hitler that Churchill was unlike any other leader he had confronted before, because others had caved. And one other key thing, maybe the most important, Churchill convinced a key member of the US Foreign Relations Committee, who a week before had suggested that Churchill abandon the British Isles. He said there's no way, they don't have the will, they don't have the means to defend their territory. And a day or two after Churchill's speech, the senator did a complete 180. He lauded Churchill. He was convinced that, he said, this is what I was looking for. Now I believe that Churchill has the stomach and the means to hold out as long as he can.
At that time, Churchill, he just replaced Chamberlain, right? Neville Chamberlain. He just replaced him. And there's probably still voices in Britain saying, let's negotiate with Hitler. Let's just make peace. Let's not fight, right? There's got to be a bunch of that still going on, right?
It was, including in his own cabinet, his foreign minister, Lord Halifax, very much in favor of, well, let's at least find out what he's willing to offer.
This is almost like a big middle finger to that and saying, we're not negotiating. We're not surrendering. We're going to basically burn this whole place down before we quit. Like, we're going to fight in the hills, fight in the streets, like that speech. And this is like a opening salvo to that, right? Saying we are not going quietly into the night and we're not negotiating. This is a big move.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Churchill is renowned as a master of the English language, but he also firmly believed that actions were more important than words. And this certainly demonstrated.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've been there. Like about maybe 2 years back, my wife and I were lucky enough to take a trip to London. And one of the highlights for me of the trip was Churchill's underground war room.
War room. Oh, yeah.
Oh, how great is that?
Incredible.
So crazy. It's so, you feel like you're back in 1940. You feel like Churchill's going to walk out. Like you think he's in one of the rooms, he's going to come out and say hello. Like it's
so
crazy.
Well done. Yeah. And you know, he stood there, he sat in that chair right across the room. They have a couple of his old cigars.
Yeah, cigars. And they have like mannequins of him like at the desk smoking the cigar. Like, it is crazy. Like it's right by, we're like at 10 Downing Street and we kind of walk around the block, maybe down the block. And then all of a sudden you just see a sign that says Churchill War Room. We're like, let's go. And you kind of go into the bunker. It is so wild. Like it's worth flying across just to go there. I told that we did that on our first day and we kind of walked by 10 Downing Street and then we went into the bunker And we still had like the whole trip in front of us. I told my wife, if we went home right now, it was a good trip.
It's already a good trip.
It was already a
Good
good
for
trip,
you.
like 4 hours in like, we're just walking around that part of London. I'm like, the rest of the trip's a bonus.
Good for
It
you.
was
You're part of the
crazy.
club now, Joe.
It's so good. In Churchill, let's talk about him for a second. Many people have heard the name. If you ever watched the History Channel for 10 minutes in World War II, you probably know something about him, right? So I just finished a book from Andrew Ross Sorkin, 1929,
Oh yeah.
right, about the crash,
Yep.
the stock market crash. And Churchill, there's chapters on him. He is a part of that story. And talking about how much money he lost in the stock market
It was a
and
mess.
a
Yeah.
mess. And then he got hit by a car in New York City. Like he almost died. A car ran him over. Like this guy's just a monster. Oh, not monster. I mean, I'm a big fan, but
No,
he's
I
like
know what you mean. I
he's
know what
like
you mean.
this
The best sense of the
giant.
word.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He's a giant of what would you call that? The 20th century, I guess. Yeah, it'd be the 1900s.
I do
Uh,
that too. I have to think. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. You gotta go back one. It's the up one, 20th century. What made him so special? Like, why is he still 100 years later, still like a giant of history?
I read somewhere William F. Buckley said,
Yeah.
as long as great men are talked about, Winston Churchill will be talked about. And he made an impact on Britain, especially, but on the world in so many ways. And like you said, there are so many angles and aspects and layers to his life. He was a hero in the First World War. He escaped from a prisoner of war camp before the war. He fought in Cuba. He sought out battle. He wanted to be on the front lines. If he had never been prime minister, he would probably be remembered best for being one of the very few outspoken voices against Adolf Hitler during the 1930s, when the general consensus was, let's not poke this tiger. Let's not provoke him to attack another country or take over another country. Let's let him have Austria. Let's let him have Czechoslovakia. And Churchill was adamant about his evil, about his intentions. And he was also very outspoken about how lax Great Britain was in preparing for an eventual war. I mean, hindsight's great, but not everybody believed that they would actually be provoked to war at that point in time. But Churchill was unrelenting both in criticizing the eventual enemy and also trying to ensure that Britain was ready for battle when the battle eventually came. And then, of course, he was the man who led Britain through the war. He kept them engaged until America joined the war. And there's a story, it's not in my book, but on Pearl Harbor, he actually had the American ambassador, John Wynett, at his house, his country home, Chartwell. I'm not sure for the day or for the weekend. And radio reports started coming in about an attack on a US base in Hawaii. And he called Roosevelt and learned that it was really on. And Churchill later wrote that he went to bed that night sleeping the sleep of the saved and the thankful, because
Wow.
he knew America would finally have to join in the war. And the Allies would eventually win.
Doing some correlations between your book and like 1929, the power of just being a great communicator, which Churchill was one of the legends of history, just how great he was with his speeches and with the English language. Like he would you still listen to his speeches now, like the one we'll fight in the streets, we'll fight in the, you want to tackle somebody. Like it's 100 years old, that speech. And like, it's given by a guy that was dead before I was born. And like, you want to go out and wrestle somebody. You know what I mean? Like, it's just so motivating. And then, like, you go back to the 1929 book that mentions Churchill with Andrew Ross Sorkin's book. Like, they said Herbert Hoover, not thought of great in history by a lot of historians.
Right.
And one of the things, when you look at his resume, he looks great. He was a horrible communicator, like horrible, like really bad, like the opposite of Churchill. So, like, the ability to communicate just can change people in the moment to follow you. But then afterwards, like you have this like positive mojo about you throughout history because you just communicated and connected with so many people. It's a superpower to communicate like that, isn't it?
It was. And he wrote all of his own speeches. I mean, who does that today?
Nobody,
Yeah.
nobody.
And he also wrote, I believe, 37 books.
Yeah.
He wrote a 6-volume history of the war. And he was not shy about saying, this isn't an intellectual work of history. This is my history of the war. So he wanted to tell the story his way, which was important to him. But that was a best-selling series in the US and the world when it came out in the late 1950s.
Of all the biographers of Churchill, who's your favorite?
It's a tie. Andrew Roberts. I know you
Yeah.
spoke with Andrew Roberts.
Yeah, he's a guest of the show. How great was, oh my gosh, getting
Yes.
him on
Oh,
was a highlight. Oh my
yeah.
gosh.
What a gentleman. But he's now Lord Roberts, I think,
Mhm.
since you spoke with him. And I think he's written the best single volume
Mhm.
biography of Churchill, and it's just captivating from his birth to his death. And then Paul Reed, who wrote the third volume of what people call the Manchester books. The first book my mom gave me was the second book of the Manchester books, which talked about Churchill through the 30s up into the beginning of the war. And Manchester's intent was to finish his trilogy, and he had several strokes, was in ill health, and he recognized he was not going to be able to finish the trilogy. And there was a period of time where Churchill geeks like me had been told and sensed that we're never going to know the rest of the story, at least the way Manchester was going to tell it. And he said he had no interest in a collaborator. And then finally, he met Paul Reed, who was a journalist in Florida, and the two of them became great friends. And Paul ended up writing the third volume of that trilogy. So that his book is roughly the size of Andrew Roberts' book, the length of the Andrew Roberts' book, but it covers just
That's like
from
that. It's like
day
a,
one of the war to Churchill's death. So it gets into
wow.
microscopic detail, and it's written by a journalist who handles it. The stories a slightly different way, and it makes it extremely readable.
A great quote you have in the book from Churchill. I guess why they had to bomb an ally to move their cause forward. You write that Churchill said, we had to show the world that we would stop at nothing. And I think that just goes to what people, we're not going to make a peace with Hitler. We're not going to appease him. We're not going to sign some agreement that he's going to break 20 minutes later. He's like, fight in the streets, fight in the alleys, fight on the beaches. And he basically inspired a nation slash the Western Hemisphere to keep going till the Americans jumped in, right? It's
He
so
did.
crazy.
Yep. More so with his actions than his words. And again, it was at a point in time when Britain was probably at its most vulnerable. Germany had overrun France, and the Dunkirk evacuation is justifiably celebrated, where about a third of a million soldiers, about a quarter million of them were British soldiers, were able to make it back from France, back to England to eventually renew the fight. But they left almost all of their tanks, almost all of their heavy guns over in France. The Royal Air Force was practically decimated. Churchill was, again, so inclined to help France early in the war that he permitted initially more Royal Air Force planes, Spitfires and Hurricanes, to support the French war effort than was practical at the time. And he was finally convinced that, hey, we need a core of air support for our island nation. And fortunately, he finally was convinced to maintain a bottom line. It was 25 squadrons, which were instrumental in the Battle of Britain, which began in July of 1940.
Churchill, like he loved France, right? Like he spoke the language, he spoke French. Wasn't Napoleon one of his heroes?
Napoleon was his primary military hero.
Hero, yeah.
Churchill was
And
a romantic. He loved Joan of Arc as well. But yeah, he liked Napoleon for what he accomplished. Yeah.
loved the country. He loved like Napoleon. Like his heroes were French. He spoke French. He appreciated the culture. How hard do you think it was to move on those ships? You think that weighed on him at all?
Oh, heavily.
Yeah.
And there's a story, I think I only have a portion of a page on it, but Lord Beaverbrook, who was kind of the Rupert Murdoch of Britain at the time.
Mhm.
He owned the two largest newspapers. On and off, he and Churchill were friends, and Churchill had a column in one of Beaverbrook's papers. But the year before the war, Beaverbrook canceled Churchill's contract because he felt Churchill was too much of a warmonger. And he told an associate that Churchill has to be stopped. He's leading us into war. So he was poised to be quite a challenger to Churchill. And Churchill invited him into his cabinet, and he appointed him the Minister of Air Production, which was a ministry that did not exist at the time. And Beaverbrook, he went on a rampage to make sure that he secured every piece of aircraft possible for Britain. He stole from other ministries. He made sure the factories ran overtime and got all the supplies they needed. But there's a story the night before the bombing, the night before the attack at Mirs el Kabir, Beaverbrook was with Churchill. And Beaverbrook said he helped convince Churchill. He said, if we don't destroy the ships, Hitler's going to insist that he get control of those ships. If the French refuse, he's going to threaten to burn Nice, he's going to threaten to burn Marseille, he's going to threaten to burn Paris. So it's incumbent on us to make sure that he doesn't have that opportunity. And he said they went for a walk. Churchill finally made his decision that they would, if necessary, attack the next day. And he said that during their walk through the gardens of number 10 Downing Street, Churchill wept because he was so upset at what he had decided to do against the action he decided to take against France.
Wow. When you read that, you see where history, sometimes when it's taught wrong, it's just cold facts and what happened on what day, but you get like the human side of it. And that's just powerful. So
Yeah, I'm sure, I know Andrew Ross Sorkin does it too, not writing about the stock market and the numbers, it's the people involved.
it's the stories that created, it's the people and the
personalities.
personalities that created that situation, right?
Yes.
And it always comes down to like humility, greed, ego, narcissism. Like it comes down to those things, and you could dial everything down to what happened to one of those core human elements. It's so
Yeah,
wild.
those people are as imperfect as the rest of us.
Yeah, yeah. No matter what title they have and what they ran and how much money they had and how many servants or how big their army was, it all comes down to either greed, humility, ego, that kind of doubt,
Sure.
hubris. So wild. How about this? I never met an author that didn't learn something writing the book that they wrote. So, what was the biggest lesson that you taught yourself writing this book?
I started this project thinking it was much more black and white than it was. Church, like initially, in my mind, it was a no-brainer. Churchill had to do this. And also his prime adversary was Admiral Francois Darlan of France. And initially thought, I am blessed with a villain. So you have Churchill and you have a natural villain because Darlan was the French admiral who initially indicated he might sail his ships to Britain or America, but finally he was adamant that number one, he did not want them to fall into Hitler's hands, but also he did not want them to fall into Churchill's hands. But as I got deeper into the research and the writing, I learned that first, Darlan initially was not as much of a villain as I first perceived him. But then I later learned, in some respects, he was even more of a villain because after this event, he collaborated with Hitler and with Germany. So he was a villain in a different way. And I also learned that Churchill's decision was not black and white. It was much more nuanced. And he hated making that decision. There were several other options for him about other ships to take under British control. So it was interesting and a challenge learning and putting together how those different alternative decisions work together and why he ultimately made the decision that he did.
I appreciate you sharing that. How about this? Let's switch over to a part of, like, say, the creative process. When you
Mm-hmm.
write a book to this knowledge, how long did it take you from start to finish? And then how long does the research part take compared to the writing part? Or do you write as you research? How does that work?
I'm sure I took a non-traditional approach because I started this when I was working a full-time job. And this was an interest and a passion. It was something that kept my mind engaged when I was riding on trains and taking flights across the Northeast US. And I wanted to learn more and more about this. It became really serious for me, or like a real project, when in 2012, my wife and I were in London. We made the pilgrimage to the Churchill War Rooms, and then we spent 3 days at the University of Cambridge, where the Churchill archives were. And I was surprised at how welcoming they were to a software salesman. I kept waiting for someone to tap me on the back and say, "What are you doing here? You don't belong here." And there and at other archives, it was astounding how welcoming and willing to help and how helpful people were. So the research, it got heavier as time went on. I eventually retired about 5 years ago, but probably 15 years of research. And then I'm a slow writer, probably 5 years of writing and rewriting. I'm a constant rewriter. And I eventually cut quite a bit that was in the initial manuscript, which made it, I think, a better story, a tighter, more compelling, more readable book. So as I was learning the story, as I was writing the story, I was also focused on making myself a better writer. So that was part of the process as well. You could call it the 15-year process, which is, I know, is abnormal.
What did it feel like when you opened the box and you saw the first copies?
It was humbling. It was a little bit of ecstasy. Like I knew they were coming. I practically have the story memorized by now. But when you see it physically and take it in your hands, it's this. Honestly, this is my legacy too. I have 4 grandchildren. My one disappointment is my publisher does not put their authors' pictures on their books. So my grandsons and granddaughters won't look and see Papa Bill's picture on the book. But when they learn to read, they'll find out it's something that I wrote. So that's a good feeling too.
That is super cool. Now, congrats on that. When you're in the middle of this and you need
Mhm.
like to clear your mind, recharge your body, what do you do? How do you clear your
Walk.
head?
I used to ride my bike a lot. I used to rollerblade, and I got to the point that I was old enough and maybe wise enough where I just didn't want to take any risks because I had some people I worked with that depended on me, my family that depended on me. So I wanted to not worry about crashing into a car or rollerblading over a manhole cover, which I did once. That was the last time I rollerbladed. So I just got into walking. I live in Lancaster County. It's a very pretty rural area. So I love going on walks through our neighborhood, or sometimes I'll go over to the farmland. I have a walk that takes me across a couple of covered bridges. So it's very relaxing. You kind of shut out the rest of the world, or it's not a real nice day here today. So went to the gym, went on the treadmill.
You ever do any weighted vest? Did you ever put a weighted vest on? Did you ever try
No,
that?
no, I have not. Have not.
Yeah,
Glad you
I
do that.
discovered that a little while ago, and that you could go like 10, 20, 30 pounds on the weighted vest. It turns the walk, not just a walk, it turns the walk into a workout. It's pretty cool. Yeah, because I love being outside with the dog. And sometimes I can either walk the dog or work out, and the dog needs to work out. So I'll throw like the weighted vest on and we'll go for 2 mile walk. And at the end, I'm like, all right, that was a workout. Like
I'll
walking up
do
some
that.
hills with the dog. It's a
You'll
cheat code I
never.
learned.
Yeah, I'll never get into Brazilian jiu-jitsu if you do that.
No surgeries. It keeps you from the
Good,
surgeries.
good.
Last question about Churchill. So, when you have like a legend of history, what's it feel like going into the archives and pulling out papers that he wrote and signed and handled? Like, what is that like? What's that feel like? Is that wild?
Oh, it was special. I think it was my second day at Cambridge, and I was going through the archives of General Edward Sir Lewis Spears, and just happened to find a letter that Churchill had written to him, and it was signed by him. And I'm Roman Catholic, but I swear it sounded like it was an angel looking over my shoulder. I could hear harp music in the air almost. It was just a magical feeling that I was that close, that I was touching a piece of paper that he had handled and he had signed. Getting that close to history was a very special feeling. I got to the point where I really enjoyed writing, but the research is even more fun. Just, finding new stories, going through the papers of these genuine heroes, some are very obscure heroes, learning their side of the story is just fascinating.
Ryan Holiday said, if you have writer's block, it's not right. There's no such thing. You just didn't do enough research.
That's true,
Yeah,
especially with nonfiction, because
yeah.
there's always something new you can find.
If you have nothing to write about, just you got to go back to the research and dig
That's right.
deeper.
It's there.
Yeah, absolutely. How about this last question, Bill? If you could have everyone listening take just one lesson away from everything we discussed, Churchill, Hitler, bombing allies, tough decisions, the stock market, writing about history. You have one lesson you could take away. What would that lesson be?
Take the long view. Consider the impact of your action, not just on today, actions and decisions, not just on today, but on your future. Obviously, keep your best interests and the best interests of who you're responsible for. In Churchill's case, it was an entire nation, eventually, maybe an entire world. Don't lose sight of that in making your day in, day out decisions.
Take the long view. I love it. I think take the long view is about as good as a spot as any to wrap this up. Bill, before we leave, I want to close with a paragraph from your book I pulled out. Thank you for the early copy.
Hey,
Uh, and I
reading
quote,
it.
yeah, all right. I quote, on July 3rd, 1940, Winston Churchill ordered the Royal Navy to open fire on French ships anchored in Algeria. Nearly 1,300 sailors, allies, just weeks before, died in 13 minutes. It was desperate. It was calculated. It was justified by survival. Sometimes what it costs to survive is measured in the blood of friends. The book is Operation Catapult. The author is Bill Whiteside, coming out everywhere on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Bill, I'd like to thank you for joining us. Appreciate you. Thanks for walking us through some epic history. Bill, if people are looking for you and what you do online, where can we find you?
First, thank you, Joe. This is such a pleasure. I appreciate you taking the time to prepare and for having me on. This time just flew by for me. I have a website. It's www.perfectlytruestory.com. No spaces, no punctuation, perfectlytruestory.com. The most important thing is there's a newsletter archive there. So there's a lot of different stories about Churchill, about this clash. There's an interview with a Frenchman whose grandfather died in the clash. So there's an eclectic pile of information on that website. So I encourage anybody who's interested in learning more to visit there.
What I'll do is I'll put a link to the website, perfectlytruestory.com, your
Thank you.
book, and the link to our first podcast on. But Bill, man, thanks for joining us. Wish you and the book much success. And man, so great to see you.
Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you for doing your homework. Thank
So
you.
good
Great
luck to
seeing you.
everybody.
Sure.
I'll see you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.